6 years. 6 years of his life to know. Gone in under a minute. Because one man decided he didn't matter.
They watched him walk out like he was nothing. None of them knew what he really owned.
That night, he made one call, and everything they thought they knew about him was about to change.
He wasn't just an employee. He was the man who owned the company that fired him. He didn't come back for revenge. He came back to make sure it never happened to anyone else again.
If you have ever been humiliated in front of people who were supposed to respect you, stay until the end of this video, because what this single father did after being fired is the kind of quiet, cold justice you will want to watch twice. Before we go any further, if stories about underestimated people rising up speak to you, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel, because this story is about to prove one simple truth. Never assume you know who you are really talking to. Daniel Reyes had exactly $14 in his checking account and a 7-year-old daughter named Mia waiting for him at his sister's apartment when Bradford Logistics let him go on a Tuesday morning in front of the entire warehouse floor. "Effective immediately," said Vance Calloway, the regional operations director, holding a manila folder like it was a weapon. "Company restructuring. We're going in a different direction." Daniel had been a shift supervisor at Bradford Logistics for 6 years. He knew every dock door, every forklift's quirks, every driver's route by heart. He had trained half the people standing there, pretending not to watch. His daughter's medication, his rent, his dignity, all of it balanced on a job that had just evaporated because Vance wanted his cousin in the supervisor role instead. 6 years, Daniel said quietly. "I gave this place 6 years, and Bradford appreciates your service." Vance said, already turning away, already done with him. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He walked to his locker, took out the photo of Mia taped to the inside door, folded it carefully into his wallet, and walked out into a parking lot so bright it hurt his eyes. He sat in his 10-year-old truck for 11 minutes before he could make his hands stop shaking enough to start the engine. Through the windshield, he watched the warehouse he'd helped run for 6 years go on functioning without him. Forklifts still moving, drivers still pulling in and out of the bay doors. The whole machine indifferent to the fact that one of its parts had just been quietly removed and discarded. There was something almost unbearable about how little his absence seemed to change anything from the outside, as if 6 years could disappear from a building's memory in the time it took to clear out a locker. He thought about calling his sister right then. But he didn't want Mia to hear the tremor still in his voice when he picked up the phone, so he drove instead, aimlessly, past the elementary school where Mia would be sitting through her afternoon reading block, past the diner where he sometimes treated her to pancakes on Saturday mornings, when the budget allowed for it, past the small brick house he and Elena had bought together, and that he still lived in alone with his daughter, until the shaking finally settled enough that he could trust himself to walk through his sister's door and be, for Mia's sake, a man who had not just lost the only steady thing keeping their small life afloat. What none of them knew, what Daniel himself had almost forgotten in the daily grind of shift schedules and daycare pickups and stretching $40 across a week of groceries, was that 6 years ago, before Bradford Logistics existed, before Vance Calloway ever set foot in that warehouse, Daniel Reyes had been someone else. Not in some fantastical sense. In a very real, very legal, very documented sense, Daniel's late father, Arthur Reyes, had built a trucking and freight brokerage empire from a single flatbed truck in 1987. By the time Arthur passed away 8 years ago, Reyes Freight Holdings quietly owned warehouses, distribution contracts, and controlling shares in dozens of smaller logistics companies across 4 states, one of which folded into a larger holding company years before anyone renamed the sign out front, was Bradford Logistics itself. Daniel had walked away from all of it after his wife Elena died in a car accident when Mia was 2. Grief does strange things to a man. He didn't want board meetings and quarterly earnings calls. He wanted to be near his daughter, to make her lunch himself, to be an ordinary man, doing ordinary work, invisible in the best way. He'd put his shares into a trust managed by his father's old attorney and lifelong friend, Marcus Whitfield, and he had taken a floor job under his mother's maiden name. Reyes had become simply Daniel R. on the Bradford paperwork, and nobody in that building had ever bothered to check further than the name on a W-2. For 6 years, Daniel had quietly, deliberately been nobody. He liked being nobody. Nobody had to watch their daughter grow up in double shifts and worry about parent-teacher conferences, colliding with mandatory overtime. Being somebody had cost him everything that mattered once already. He still remembered, with the kind of clarity grief burns into a person, the last real conversation he'd had with Elena before the accident. They'd been sitting on the back steps of the house his father had helped them buy, watching Mia chase fireflies across the yard in the blue dusk of a July evening, and Elena had turned to him with that half-teasing, half-serious look she always wore when she was about to say something important. "You know you don't have to keep proving you're not your father," she'd said. "Running the company doesn't make you him. Running from it doesn't make you not him either. You're allowed to just be Daniel." He'd laughed it off that night the way you laugh off things that are too true to sit with comfortably. 3 weeks later, a delivery truck ran a red light on Route 9, and Elena was gone. And Daniel spent the following year understanding exactly what she'd meant, except by then there was no one left to tell that she'd been right. Arthur Reyes had wanted his son in the boardroom from the time Daniel could tie his own shoes. Arthur had built Reyes Freight Holdings out of nothing. A single flatbed truck bought with a loan he almost didn't get approved for, a marriage that didn't survive the 18-hour days of the company's early years, and a stubbornness that Daniel had inherited whether he wanted to or not. By the time Daniel was 25, he'd already sat through hundreds of Arthur's board meetings, had learned to read a balance sheet before he'd learned to change a tire, had been groomed, quietly and relentlessly, to take over an empire he'd never asked to inherit. When Elena died, something in Daniel simply refused to keep performing that role. He remembered standing in his father's office 3 months after the funeral, Arthur's old leather chair still smelling faintly of the cigars he wasn't supposed to smoke anymore, and telling his father that he was stepping back, not selling his shares, not walking away entirely, but stepping back from the visible, public, relentless work of running things. Arthur, surprisingly, hadn't fought him on it. "Your mother left because I never learned how to just be a father instead of a company," Arthur had said, older and grayer than Daniel had ever seen him. "Don't make my mistake twice, in the other direction. Go be someone Mia can find when she needs you. The company will still be here." Arthur died 2 years later of a heart attack in that same office, and Daniel had grieved him with the strange, complicated love of a son who understood his father far better after both of the people who'd shaped him were gone. He'd kept his promise, though. He'd stayed invisible, stayed close to Mia, stayed a floor supervisor instead of a chairman, right up until the moment Vance Calloway decided that invisibility meant disposability. But sitting in that parking lot, feeling the particular sting of being discarded by people who would never have dared treat him that way if they'd known his name, something in Daniel shifted. He drove to his sister Carla's apartment first, because Mia's school let out an hour before his shift usually ended, and Carla had been covering the gap for years without ever once complaining. Carla took one look at his face when he walked through her door and knew something was wrong before he said a word. "You're early," she said, setting down the dish towel in her hands. "Daniel, what happened?" "Bradford let me go," he said, and even saying it out loud felt strange, like describing an injury that hadn't fully registered yet. "Restructuring. Vance gave his cousin my job." Carla's jaw tightened. She had never liked Vance Calloway, not since the office holiday party 2 years earlier when she'd overheard him mocking a dock worker's accent to a group of laughing supervisors. "That little... Daniel, you've been there 6 years. 6 years, and they walk you out like you stole something?" "That's about the size of it," Daniel said, and managed something close to a smile for Mia's sake as his daughter came skidding around the corner with a paper towel roll and a bottle of white glue, already talking about lava colors before she'd even said hello. "Daddy, look, I need red and orange tissue paper for the volcano. Ms. Hargrove said we can use tissue paper or paint, and I think tissue paper looks more realistic, doesn't it?" "Doesn't it look more realistic?" "It absolutely does," Daniel said, crouching down to her level, letting the day's humiliation fold itself small enough to fit behind his ribs where Mia couldn't see it. "We'll get some tissue paper this weekend. I promise." Carla watched her brother disappear so completely into being a father in the space of 4 seconds that she almost forgot for a moment what he'd just told her. It was a skill Daniel had built over years of practice, the ability to set down whatever was breaking him and become instantly, fully, a steady presence for his daughter. Carla had always admired it and worried about it in equal measure because she knew what it cost a person to keep doing that, day after day, without ever once letting the cracks show. He drove Mia home to Carla's spare bedroom, listened to her chatter about the science fair volcano she was building, made her mac and cheese, read her 2 chapters of a book about a brave rabbit, and tucked her into bed. Only after her door was closed did he sit at Carla's kitchen table and call the one number he hadn't dialed in 6 years. "Marcus," he said when the old attorney picked up. "It's Daniel. I need you to pull up everything on Bradford Logistics." There was a pause on the line, the sound of a man setting down a glass of scotch. "Daniel Reyes. I wondered when you'd call. What happened?" "They fired me today, Vance Calloway. Told me the company was going in a different direction." Marcus Whitfield had known Arthur Reyes for 40 years and had watched Daniel grow up in boardrooms he'd later run from. He didn't laugh, though the irony was almost too rich to bear. "Daniel, you understand that Reyes Holdings owns 61% of Bradford's parent company. You could have fired him instead." "I know," Daniel said. "I've always known. I just didn't want to be that person again. So what do you want to do now?" Daniel looked toward Mia's door, thought of the folder Vance had carried like a trophy, thought of the guards who'd watched him walk to his truck like he was a criminal instead of a man who had trained most of the building. "I want a full audit," Daniel said. "Payroll, safety violations, everything Vance Calloway has touched in the last 3 years. And Marcus, I want it done quietly. I don't want a single person in that building to know who's asking until I decide they need to know." "That," Marcus said, and Daniel could hear the old man smile, "I can absolutely do." What Marcus's team found over the next 10 days was worse than Daniel expected. Vance Calloway hadn't just fired Daniel to make room for his cousin, a man named Ricky Calloway, who had exactly 4 months of forklift experience and 2 prior write-ups for safety violations at a different company. Vance had spent 3 years quietly gutting safety protocols to hit bonus-triggering efficiency numbers. He'd falsified 2 OSHA inspection logs. He'd been skimming overtime hours from part-time dock workers, shaving 15 minutes off clock-ins across the board. A theft so small per person that nobody complained loudly, but one that added up to almost $200,000 a year, quietly funneled into efficiency bonus categories that inflated Vance's own compensation. Worse, Marcus's investigators found that Vance had fired 3 other employees in the past 2 years under suspiciously similar circumstances, each one a person who had either questioned a safety shortcut or who occupied a role Vance wanted for a friend or relative. A woman named Priscilla Ogun had been let go for attendance issues 4 months after she filed an internal safety complaint about a malfunctioning loading lift that Vance ignored. 2 months later, a worker named Terrence Cole slipped on that same lift and broke his wrist. Bradford's insurance had quietly settled it and buried the incident report. Daniel read every page Marcus sent him at Carla's kitchen table at 2 in the morning, Mia's volcano project sitting half-finished on the counter beside him, and felt something harden in his chest that had nothing to do with his own firing anymore. This wasn't about revenge for himself. It had started that way, if he was honest. The humiliation of being marched out by a man 12 years younger, who'd never worked a single overnight shift in his life. But by the 3rd night of reading through Marcus's files, it had become about Priscilla and Terrence and every dock worker who'd had 15 minutes stolen off their timesheet every single day for 3 years so Vance Calloway could buy a boat. On the 11th day, Daniel put on the one good suit he still owned, the one he'd worn to Elena's funeral and hadn't touched since, and drove to the downtown offices of Reyes Freight Holdings for the first time in 6 years. The receptionist, a young woman who hadn't been there when he left, looked at him blankly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Daniel said, "but Marcus Whitfield is expecting me, and I believe my name is still on the building." Marcus met him in the lobby himself, older now, more gray in his hair, but his eyes lit up the way they used to when Arthur Reyes walked into a room. "Well," Marcus said, shaking his hand. "Welcome back, Mr. Reyes." They spent the morning going over the numbers. Daniel authorized the reinstatement of his full voting authority over Bradford's board, a formality, since he'd never truly relinquished it, only ignored it. He reviewed severance calculations for the 3 wrongfully terminated employees, plus back pay for every stolen minute across 3 years of falsified timesheets, an amount that made Marcus's accountant whistle low under his breath. And then Daniel asked for one more thing. "I want to be there when it happens," he said. "Not on a phone call, not through a memo. I want to walk into that warehouse myself." Marcus studied him for a long moment. "You understand there's a simpler way to do this, Daniel. One email from legal. Vance is gone by Friday. Nobody has to see your face at all." "I know," Daniel said. "But 6 years ago I walked away from being Arthur Reyes' son because I didn't want the noise. I'm not doing this for noise now either. I'm doing it because a man looked at 6 years of my life and decided it meant nothing, and I want him to understand exactly what he threw away." 3 days later, on a Friday morning that mirrored the one that had ended his old life, Daniel Reyes walked back through the doors of Bradford Logistics wearing a gray suit instead of a work vest, flanked by Marcus Whitfield and 2 members of the corporate compliance team carrying thin black folders of their own. Word moved through the warehouse floor like electricity. Drivers stopped mid-conversation. Forklift operators slowed their machines to watch. Someone dropped a clipboard. Vance Calloway came around the corner from his office, already annoyed at the interruption, the same expression he'd worn the day he fired Daniel, and stopped dead when he recognized the face. "Daniel?" he said, confused rather than alarmed, because confusion always comes before fear. "What are you doing here? Are you here about your termination paperwork? Because that's already been processed, there's nothing to." "Vance," Marcus Whitfield said, stepping forward with the calm authority of a man who had spent 4 decades in rooms exactly like this one. "I'd like to introduce you properly to Daniel Reyes, majority shareholder of Reyes Freight Holdings, which owns 61% of Bradford Logistics' parent company. Effective this morning, Mr. Reyes has resumed active oversight of this facility." The color drained out of Vance Calloway's face in real time, like watching a photograph fade in reverse. That's not possible," Vance said. Daniel worked the floor. He drove a forklift. He clocked in and out like everyone else. "I did," Daniel said, and his voice was quiet, the same quiet voice he'd used the day Vance fired him, except now the whole warehouse was listening. "For 6 years, I worked the floor because I wanted to. Because being ordinary was the only piece I had left after I lost my wife. I trained half the people in this building. I covered shifts when their kids were sick. I never once used my name to get an easier assignment or a better schedule, because I didn't want that life anymore." He let that sit in the silence of the warehouse for a moment. "And then, you fired me in front of everyone I'd spent 6 years working beside, so your cousin could have my job. You didn't even wait until the end of the shift. You didn't offer a real reason. You made a decision about a man's livelihood in less time than it takes to eat lunch, because you assumed I was nobody, and nobody's feelings don't matter. Daniel, I didn't know. If I'd known who you..." "That's exactly the problem," Daniel said, cutting him off, still calm, still quiet. "You shouldn't need to know who somebody is related to before you decide to treat them like a human being. That's not how Priscilla Ogun should have been treated when she reported a broken safety lift, and you fired her for it 4 months later. That's not how Terrence Cole should have had his broken wrist quietly settled and buried so it wouldn't touch your bonus numbers. That's not how $200,000 in stolen overtime should have funded your boat while dock workers wondered why their checks were always 15 minutes short." Vance's mouth opened and closed. There was nothing to say to any of it, because all of it was documented, all of it was true, and all of it was sitting in the black folders Marcus's compliance team was holding. "Effective immediately," Daniel said, and there was no pleasure in his voice. "Only the flat finality of a decision correctly made. You're terminated for cause, which under your contract forfeits your severance and your remaining stock options. Legal will be filing a report with the Department of Labor regarding the timesheet falsification. and separately with OSHA regarding the safety violations you buried. Ricky will not be joining this team. His safety record disqualifies him from consideration. He turned, slowly, to look at the gathered crowd of drivers, forklift operators, dock workers, people whose names he actually knew, whose kids' birthdays he remembered, whose worst days he'd covered without ever once mentioning who his father had been. Priscilla Ogon and Terrence Cole are being reinstated this week with full back pay and formal apologies, Daniel continued. Every single one of you is getting an audit of your timesheets going back 3 years, and any stolen time will be repaid with interest, starting with your next check. Safety inspections will be conducted by an independent third party every quarter from now on, and any supervisor who retaliates against someone for reporting a hazard will be gone the same day. No exceptions, regardless of whose cousin they happen to be. Vance made one last attempt, his voice cracking in a way it never had when he was the one holding the folder. Daniel, please, I have a mortgage, I have a family, if you just give me a chance to. Priscilla Ogun had a family too, Daniel said, and for the first time his voice lost a little of its evenness. She had a teenage son who watched his mother lose her job for doing the right thing. Terrence Cole had a family, working with a cracked wrist for 2 weeks, because he was afraid asking for time off would get him fired next. You didn't think about their mortgages when you buried their complaints to protect your bonus. I'm not interested in the version of fairness that only shows up once it's your turn to lose something. Vance had no answer for that because there wasn't one. Security escorted him out through the same bay doors Daniel had walked through 11 days earlier, and the symmetry of it was not lost on anyone standing there, least of all Daniel, who felt no triumph in it, only a tired, settling kind of relief, the way a wound feels once it has finally properly been cleaned. Someone in the back, Daniel thought it might have been an older dock worker named Sal, who'd taught him how to properly secure a flatbed load back when Daniel first started, began to clap. It spread slowly, awkwardly, the way applause does when people aren't sure if it's allowed, and then all at once, the way water finds its level. Daniel didn't smile. He wasn't there for applause. He nodded once, shook Marcus's hand, and told the assembled crew that his door, the real one, upstairs at Reyes Holdings, would be open to any of them if the new management ever forgot the lesson Vance had just been taught. Then he drove home, picked Mia up from Carla's, and helped her glue the last piece of red construction paper lava onto her volcano for the science fair, because that, in the end, was the only title that had ever mattered to him. The weeks that followed were quieter than anyone at Bradford Logistics expected. Daniel didn't take a corner office. He appointed a new operations director from within, a woman named Denise Whitcomb, who had spent 11 years on the floor and had once personally walked Daniel through a fire code inspection when he was still new. He kept his old employee badge in a drawer at Reyes Holdings, a reminder of who he wanted to remain even with his name restored to every document in the building. Priscilla Ogun cried when Denise called to tell her about her reinstatement, not from relief alone, but because for 2 years she had believed her complaint about the loading lift had cost her nothing but her job, and now she understood it had actually saved someone else's life. Terrence's, even if only from a broken wrist instead of something worse. Terrence used his back pay to finally fix the transmission in his car, the one he'd been nursing along for a year because he couldn't afford the repair on stolen wages. He drove past Bradford Logistics on his way home, the day the repair was finished, windows down, radio up, and honked twice at the loading dock, just because he finally could without worrying about being noticed for the wrong reasons. Denise Whitcomb, the new operations director, called an all-staff meeting her first week, not to announce sweeping changes, but to ask a single question. What had people been afraid to say for the last 3 years that they hadn't felt safe saying out loud? The answers filled 4 legal pads. She read every single one, personally, that weekend, and started addressing them one by one the following Monday, beginning with a broken freight elevator on the East Dock that had been scheduled for repair for 11 months without ever actually being repaired. Vance Calloway's case with the Department of Labor became a slow, grinding process that would take the better part of a year, but the audit trail Marcus's team had built was airtight, and Vance's attempts to spin the story to other logistics companies in the region collapsed the moment anyone called Reyes Holdings for a reference. He never did tell his cousin Ricky why the job offer quietly disappeared. Mia's volcano won second place at the science fair, losing narrowly to a baking soda geyser built by a girl named Priya, whose father, it turned out, drove long-haul routes for Bradford Logistics and had heard the whole story from his dispatcher weeks before it reached the local news outlet that eventually ran a small piece titled, "Werhow Worker Turns Out to Own the Company. Here's what he did next." Daniel didn't do interviews. He didn't want to be a symbol or a headline. When a reporter finally tracked him down outside Mia's school, all he said was this: "I spent 6 years being an ordinary man because it was the only way I knew how to survive losing my wife. I don't regret a single shift I worked. What I regret is that it took a company forgetting who I was to remind everyone, including myself, that ordinary people deserve to be treated with dignity, whether or not somebody important is watching." He went back to being, as much as he could manage, an ordinary man. He still packed Mia's lunch every morning. He still coached her softball team on Saturdays. But once a month, quietly, without fanfare, he walked the floor of Bradford Logistics in old jeans and a Reyes Holdings polo, not to check up on anyone, but because 6 years of that floor had taught him more about what a company owed its people than any boardroom ever had. And he intended to make sure Bradford never forgot it again. Sal, the old dock worker who taught him to secure a flatbed load all those years ago, liked to tell newer hires the story every few months, usually while training them on the same equipment. "You see that man walking the floor in old jeans?" he'd say, nodding toward Daniel checking a pallet strap or chatting with a driver about a delayed shipment. "Owns half this company. Got fired from it once by a fool who never once bothered to ask who he was really talking to. Remember that. You never know who's standing across from you, and even if you did, treat them right anyway. That's the whole lesson." And somewhere in the warehouse, usually without anyone noticing, Daniel would hear it, and he'd allow himself, just for a moment, a small and private smile, not because he'd won anything, but because, for the first time since Elena died, being seen for who he really was hadn't cost him the peace he'd fought so hard to build for his daughter. It had, instead, protected it. If this story moved you even a little, remember to like this video and subscribe for more stories about quiet people who turn out to be far stronger than anyone assumed, because the next one might just be the one you needed to hear today.